Okay, let's call this meeting to order. Stand and pledge allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Behrman, would you call the roll?
I will. Knoblauch.
Here.
Gritzmaker. Here. Powel. Here. Mr. Uckele. Here. Behrman, all present.
Thank you. Okay, we have the August 9, 2021 meeting minutes before us. Are there any additions or corrections? I'd like to make two corrections. They're in the form of additions. We agreed at the last meeting that there would be a 50-foot setback from the edge of ditches and drains, and there would be a 75-foot setback from the center of the road. The language on both of those is going to need to be wordsmithed a bit to be able to accommodate any easements, statutory or otherwise, that the road commission or the drain commission might have. I was told, actually the reason I'm a little late is because Scott Merritt called me to confirm what the setbacks were for the roads, and felt that 50 to 75 feet would be more than sufficient to be able to deal with any setbacks. They actually don't have setbacks. Theirs are in the form of statutory easements that are recorded, and all of that changes. It depends on the road, it depends on the section you're in, it depends on the township you're in. So that exclusion needs to be in there, just so that we make sure that we capture everything and everybody understands that there may be statutory issues there as well.
Is it 50 foot from the ditch?
Yep, 50-foot setback from the edges of the ditches and drains. Edge of the ditch or drain. Now, I talked to Jennifer Escott, thank you, at the Drain Commission also. And theirs is usually about 40 to 45, according to Ms. Escott, who is the drain commissioner. And theirs goes from the center of the ditch. So there's about 100 feet on either side of that center line. So it's a total of 100 feet. So it's 50 feet at either side of the center line. So if we say 50 feet from the edge of the ditch or drain, that's going to be more than sufficient, she felt. Okay? So do I have a motion to approve the corrected minutes?
I make a motion that the minutes be approved as read and amended.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the August 9, 2021 minutes are approved. The next thing on the agenda, I just want to clear up some miscommunication, some misunderstandings. The Blissfield Advance had a nice article on the front page of the Advance. Of course, I'm not sure that I have it with me, but it was a nice spread. Had several issues in it, several missed or incorrect distances. Mr. Behrman was kind enough to call Ms. Berner, and the Advance did publish a correction. I've since talked with Ms. Berner, and She now has my cell number, so we can communicate and make sure that the information that's put out, published in the advance is accurate. And so I will be taking the lead on trying to make sure that the information communicated to the township residents is accurate. I also wanted to review what the Zoning and Planning Commission is charged to do. The commission, the Blissfield Township Commission has charged us with, number one, the master plan, making sure that the master plan is current, accurate, and in effect. It needs to be revised. It's time for that revision, so that's going to be done as soon as we get through with this project. We have responsibility for the ordinances in the township, and those were put into effect 2015, 2013, something like that, okay? And now they've charged us with updating those ordinances to develop a solar ordinance. We are all in this committee taking that very seriously and want everybody to understand. We're listening to everything that's said here. We're taking all of this into consideration. The other issue in the advance last month was that there was a statement attributed to Mr. Navarro that the township, or the chairperson, me, that I was to continue as chairperson, but that I was not to lead the meeting or to vote. I talked with Mr. Navarro. That statement was never made. He did not say that. As the chairperson of this committee, I am responsible for leading the discussion and making sure that we get our business done. We are going to have a solar ordinance. We've been marching that direction since I was appointed to the commission, and we're going to continue to move that direction. Also, there was an indication that the $3,000 that was allocated by the Blissfield Township Board for this purpose, it appeared like that money had been spent. It is not. We haven't touched it yet. We're going to need the help of Carlisle Wortman when it comes to putting all of this together and making sure that everything fits and that all of the provisions that need to be amended to comply with our solar ordinance are changed. That's where I see that money going. Until then, we have decisions that we need to make as township residents. I also reviewed the master plan and wanted to review that with you very briefly. The goals of the master plan are identified on page 24 in the goals and policies. It says the township shall plan future land uses to be compatible with the natural characteristics and long-term needs of the community. New development shall be well-planned, complement existing development, and be located only where land is capable of supporting it. The township shall foster the agricultural opportunities within its boundaries for residents. The township shall promote economic growth opportunities and job creation, which are complementary to existing conditions within the township. The township shall encourage cooperation with the village of Blissfield and bordering townships in an effort to promote complementary rather than competing land use decisions. The township shall seek to improve governmental services, particularly in the areas of roads and township facilities. The agricultural goal identified in the master plan specifically states, the township shall identify prime agricultural lands and prime agricultural soils for concentration of farmland preservation efforts. The township shall discourage non-agricultural development of important farmlands through master land use plan and zoning map. The township shall promote in the enrollment of PA 116 farmland agreements, purchase of development rights, PDR, conservation easements, or other means to maintain the viability of agriculture and open space in the community. In meeting the above policy, the township will consider adopting a purchase of development rights, a PDR ordinance, in an effort to enroll properties into this program. It really hasn't been an issue because much of the township agricultural land is already enrolled in PA 116. The township strongly discourages the extension of municipal sewer and water into prime farmland areas. Expansion of the system outside of the village of Blissfield is not anticipated or recommended. So very clearly, our township master plan, although it doesn't speak specifically to green energy or green conservation, does allow us to be able to form a solar ordinance and promote this kind of an endeavor, if in fact that's what the township residents want. We do have an obligation to look at these issues. There are handouts up here. One is the meeting minutes that were just approved with the two additions. The two additions are not included in it. There's a report from Epsilon, which is a peer review of a solar noise impact assessment overview. It's the RAND report that we've heard so much about. And Epsilon has reviewed that RAND report. It's essentially a peer review of it. There's only one person, so it's not a peer review panel, as you would normally consider peer review to be. But it is an analysis of that. And it's interesting because there are parts where the author agrees with the RAND report and parts where they really don't agree with that report. The other documents that are up here, it's a memo, an email that was distributed today, was sent to all of the members of the board, plus Mr. Navarro and our clerk, Diane Warner. I was not included on that email, and it's from Mr. Martis. So if anybody's interested in looking at that email, it's here for anyone to see. We're now going to open the meeting up to public comment, 3 minutes per individual. Mr. Martis.
Who furnished the Epsilon report and who paid for it?
I got it from, yes, the solar company.
ESA furnished it?
ESA
Okay.
furnished it.
Thank you.
Yes. I guess we might as well just pass all of these out. Yeah, why don't you just pass them back, Frank? You want to pass those back? Just go ahead and make sure that everybody's got what they need or want. Mr. Martis. See. Would anybody like to speak tonight? Yes, please.
My name is Noel Weitzman. I'm a non-farming rural resident of Blissfield Township. I would like to address the idea of change. For many in our community, the thought of using prime agricultural land for anything other than traditional farming is hard. Our farmland Heritage is something you're comfortable with. But I'd like for those in that camp to consider that for those of us living in the farming community, change has been happening for a long time. In 1920, 30% of our population were farmers. That percentage is now less than 2%. With an average return on investment of less than 3%, it is difficult for farmers to make a living, let alone pass on their operation to the next generation. The older generation must either sacrifice some of their life's equity, or the younger generation must take on a large debt to buy the operation. Many are not willing to take on that risk. Rather, they choose a vocation away from home, never to return. Many of the farmers in North Blissfield have witnessed their sons and daughters move away. Many have no family to take over their operation. When I was a boy, I could look across the countryside of North Blissfield. Every barn had some form of livestock. Now there is only one major livestock feeder. I recall spending my summer days hoeing my dad's sugar beets, tomatoes, and soybeans with my high school friends. Now those fields are sprayed with cost-effective pesticides due to the modification of crops so they can tolerate various chemical applications. When farms are purchased, oftentimes the purchaser will sell off the house and barns to reduce the payments on the land. Or farmers will sell lots for houses to reduce their debt. These situations have provided opportunities for non-farmers to enjoy rural living. These are the people that can be adversely affected by a solar project. These are the people we need to consider when establishing reasonable setbacks, because they move to the country with the intent of enjoying the benefits of country living. But we as non-farming rural residents need to keep the perspective that the view from our houses that we want to preserve is not ours, any more than the view that a village resident sees in their neighbor's yard is theirs to control. Change is not easy. We as a community rarely object to farmland being permanently lost to housing or development. Consider the land surrounding the village. There is over 500 acres in the past 50 to 60 years that was developed for housing or other uses in and outside the village limits. Many in this room may be old enough to remember when downtown Blissfield was a place that you could buy shoes and clothing, appliances, furniture, groceries, and hardware. All those businesses are gone now because of the choices that Blissfield residents made to shop elsewhere. Would it have been fair to those businesses that needed to fold, or future businesses, that they be required to maintain that everything you need style of business floor plan in downtown? Blissfield was forced to reinvent itself because its residents chose to do business outside of Blissfield. As a result, downtown Blissfield has revitalized and is now a destination for many people outside of this community. Change is inevitable, as shown by the examples I have listed. I'm asking that change be allowed to continue, that farmland owners' property rights be considered while providing reasonable satisfaction for our non-farming rural residents. Let's find a solution that works for all rural residents while not passing up on this opportunity for our landowners and our community as a whole.
Thank you. Noel, could I have that statement?
Sure.
Thank you. Do I have your permission to publish it on the website?
Sure.
Thank you.
I mentioned it's good.
That's okay. If anybody else would like statements of a reasonable length put on the website, for or against, please let me know. I think that's only reasonable. Yes.
Hi, I'm Josh Miller, a Blissfield resident. I live over here on Lane Street. So I was just coming to this meeting reflecting back on last meeting and some of the issues we were talking about. It was a difficult meeting, and I thank you for all sort of sticking through this and coming to a sensible conclusion. When I think back to some of the issues that were addressed at that meeting, some of them just seemed a little not satisfactory. And one that comes to mind is the setback issue, where there were some numbers thrown out. You know, there were some high numbers, there were some low numbers, and it seemed like the number that was arrived at, I think it was 150 and 300 for two different situations. And I know there's details to be worked out, like exactly where does that apply, and that's all sort of before you. But it seemed like the numbers wound up in sort of an arbitrary middle of number kind of place. And I think that that's not a good place to write policy, these local ordinances. I think that they need to be based on, for instance, what's the reason for that 150-foot setback or that 300-foot setback? And that needs to be part of the decision about what that setback is. Is it clear, solid reason, whether based on facts, or based on precedent, or based on other policies that work in other townships? So I just encourage you, as you approach some of the other thorny issues like sound, that they be based on reasonable conclusions, things that would make sense to people, even if we might disagree. At least it makes good sense. So I know we'll hit some of those tonight, but sound and issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Jim?
Yeah, Jim Isley, 2683 South Grosvenor Highway, Palmyra Township. I was able to attend last month's meeting and found it quite interesting. When the Blissfield Township Board determined to create zoning in their township, they were charged then with probably, depending on the year, to create a zoning board, or recently, I think from 2010, a zoning board, a planning commission, which you are. And there are two acts. There's the Michigan Planning Enabling Act and the Zoning Enabling Act that sets the rules of how you do your work and who you are. The acts also say there should be 5, 7, or 9 members on your commission. Blissfield Township has chosen 5. Of those members, the Planning Enabling Act or the Zoning Enabling Act state that those members should be chosen throughout the township to represent the people of the township. And so I'm here tonight wondering if those of you who sit on the Township Planning Commission could tell us where you live and what you do and where you work.
Certainly. I think that's a reasonable request. Jim, why don't you start?
Jim Uckele, for those that don't know me, I live on Suborn Highway, which is east of town here, and it's towards the edge. And I'm retired, and I do work for Uckele Health and Nutrition, but still running, and my son runs. And so anybody have any questions other than that? I'm retired, but I live east of town in that section over there. Okay.
I've been Behrman, I'm retired, and I live on Berry Road, northeast of here.
Diane Knoblauch. I am a nurse and an attorney. I have a law practice here in Blissfield. I was a resident of Blissfield for over 40 years. And still own property in Blissfield Township. Actually, the village of Blissfield, but that's part of the township too.
And where do you currently live?
I currently live in Brighton, Michigan.
My name is Bill Gritzmaker. I live on Walnut Street, right over by the high school, by the bus barn. Bus barn is my back driveway, my backyard. I am retired like most everybody else on the panel. Retired military. I currently am on the Blissfield Township Board as well as this. So I think that's why I'm here, is because I'm a board member.
My name's Don Powell. I live on Ifland Road. Ifland Road is on the north side of Blissfield along the river.
Sorry, Don.
My name is Don Powell. I live on Ifland Road. I live on the just north side of town along the river. I have 10 acres of land. I currently work for DTE Energy at the nuclear power station.
Thank you.
Yes.
Lynette Kowicki. I also am a landowner in Blissfield Township, farmer's daughter. My question, I guess, to all of the board members is, Blissfield Township is known as an agricultural community, has been for as long as I've been around. I guess that my question is, in the past, there's always been farmers on the board. How many of you were actively involved in farming?
Grew up in a farm, raised hogs until I went to college and came back. And then our business is always associated with agriculture. We made vitamin mineral mix just for hogs and cattle, sheep, and then in recent days it's mostly horses and dogs and cats. That's the way of the market nowadays, so. But always been involved with agriculture and agricultural people.
I graduated from Michigan State with a bachelor's degree in agricultural economics, School of Agricultural and Natural Resources. A retired businessman. I have a small little farm where I take in goats and chickens, mostly from 4-H programs. Once the kids graduate, the animals don't have anywhere to go. I take them in and be a good guy and give them a good home. And Lynn knows I'm very particular about my feed and my alfalfa, and he knows that I know what I'm doing. So.
Okay,
You got it.
I grew up on a farm. I'm the son of a farmer. My dad had a farm in Palmyra. We raised crops and hogs and, a few head of cattle, but I was involved with that until I went to college and got married and joined the military.
I was born and raised in Miami, Florida. My father was a Air Force mechanic or electrician. So he worked for Eastern Airlines. I guess my point is I followed him. I joined the military. I got my career from the military. I served on the nuclear submarine. And I just started with Detroit Edison 40 years ago at the nuclear power station, and I've been with Detroit Edison for 40 years. So I have not had anything to do with agriculture.
Where do I start? I was the secretary-treasurer of a farm corporation, very much involved with the business. We raised Charolais Angus steers back in the 70s. I can still smell the feed. There was a combination of fresh silage and cut up corn, chopped corn coming through that manger and going out to the steers. I can also remember cleaning out the barns.
I forgot to mention that, and I did spend 2.5 years in El Salvador with the Peace Corps, working with United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization experts from all over the world. And we were in a dairy improvement project. I was an agricultural economist for that UN-based program. So that was 2.5 years in El Salvador, and that was about 35 years ago. So yeah, that was a good experience.
And to mention, I've probably pitched more manure than anybody in this place, except maybe the guys with the steer.
Yeah, I think it's clear that there are a significant number of people on the board that have farming experience and have deep roots in the farm community and have a commitment to our farm agricultural land. So, does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. You had raised your hand.
I did. Yes. Joy Dickerson, Blissfield Township. I guess I always assumed when you people took a position on a board that you were going to be fair to all residents. There was a comment made after the meeting ended last month that I've kind of mulled around for the whole month. The committee members said, we have to cater to the farmers because they pay more property taxes. I hope money doesn't have anything to do with the decisions that are going on here. I've thought about this for a month, and I don't know if everybody realizes PA 116 is a program where the farmers get the majority of their property tax money returned to them on their tax return. So are you really sure they're paying the most property taxes? Maybe some of us little people are in the hunt of actually paying and not getting any refund. So I really hope money isn't being paid to get these decisions made.
Points are well taken, Joy. Yeah, PA 116 is a very specific program. It has very specific benefits to the farmers. If you try to take your land out, you pay 100% of what you get, the benefit that you get for 7 years, you have to repay to the state. So I would hope that money would not be an issue here in terms of the tax base for the farmers. I think that there are other economic issues that need to be taken into consideration. I'm not sure that that would be an appropriate one. That's just my opinion. Jim?
Just a reminder that PA 116 doesn't benefit farmers. It benefits anybody that owns agricultural land.
That's true. That's true. That is very true. Yes, Karen?
I'm Karen Garno, and I live on Kell Road, and we are farmers. I have a question on, this is needing to go in front of a board and zoning. If I wanted to put on my 100 acres a big pig farm, would that have to go in front of a zoning board because that is also agricultural?
The answer would be no. It would not.
Thank you.
The only way it would have to go in front of the zoning board is if you wanted a variance because of the setback allowances from the edges of the farm.
Thank you.
Ag structures are fully subject to zoning.
They are, but they
They're not
don't
building
need.
permits. But
That's right, but they would not have to come before the zoning commission.
no, the zoning administrator would issue that permit at the building inspection stage, but they would still get zoning approval for the structure.
That's correct, and it would not be questioned. Yes?
Ruth Miller, Carroll Road. So are you saying that the solar farms are going to come, for sure?
No.
Is this going to be put up for a vote for the township or for everybody involved, Riga Town and Blissfield Township, Blissfield?
I have no idea what the township board is going to do with this. They've charged us with the responsibility for developing a solar ordinance. Once we develop the draft ordinance, we will submit it to the township board, and they will determine how they're going to act on it and what's going to happen with it. In addition, that is required. There are required other steps that need to be.
Restrictive zoning.
Yes.
Clear zoning that takes the future into account. Preserve, and your point of preserving the community of Blissfield the way we know it. We know Blissfield's not the same as it was. And we know that 50 years from now, it's not going to be the same as it is today. We want to make sure that it's a community that people want to speak in. We want to make sure that we have zoning regulations that invite the community to stay vibrant, that invite people to come to this beautiful gem of a town. Bring their skills, bring their passions, and make sure that we don't fail. And zoning can have a big part in making sure that that will happen for Blissfield.
Well said. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Frank?
I've got a prepared statement, which I taped. But I've been working on this for some time, so I thought I'd try to make sure I get it straight. By the way, I'm Frank Baker, live at 273 South Monroe Street. We've been here in this community since 1978 and never lived more than 15 miles away. We started our businesses here and retired from those businesses here. And I worked for many, many years on the Blissfield Chamber of Commerce and the various departments working on economic development in Blissfield. and have always been focused on economic development. I don't think I've ever seen an opportunity for economic development like this before in this community. It carries with it so many advantages and so little downside. So now I'll go into my prepared remarks. And I'd like to appeal to the Planning Commission to understand that we are not an island unto itself. The Blissfield Township Planning Commission should consider an even larger set of issues. Let me start with a fundamental realization. We are in the early stages of an existential threat to humanity. Global warming and climate change can no longer be considered a myth. The evidence of its effects is in the daily news and weather reports. The science and data are now indisputable. Humans have run out of time to debate this any longer. Immediate change is needed to avoid the worst consequences of our fossil fuel lifestyle. Now the good news. We already have the basic technical tools needed to immediately make dramatic changes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And these solar proposals are exactly that. Even better news is the rate of development of even better technologies. 9 years ago, we installed a solar electric array in our home in Blissfield. We also recently purchased 2 electric vehicles, which has eliminated our transportation gasoline costs. It's even possible to use those vehicles to power our house if we have a power failure. And those systems have paid for themselves many times over. And the good news now is that you can buy those systems a lot cheaper than what we paid for those. And we paid for them in a relatively short order. Yes, we got subsidies, we got tax breaks of various sorts. It's a long story, I'm not going to go into all that. But take a look at today at what it costs and what kind of return on investment you're going to get. And it's very compelling, without even taking into consideration the environmental issues. I've seen an awful lot of misinformation out there, and cherry-picking data and information to support an opinion is misleading at best. The shortcomings in our public policy and awareness was dramatically illustrated in Hurricane Ida, which decimated communities from the Gulf of Mexico to New England. As an example of misguided public policy, begin your research in New Orleans, when in 2016, Entergy New Orleans undermined efforts to build microgrids in lieu of a $210 million gas turbine plant. The plant went dark in the hurricane. Because the old grid model failed, doesn't mean a distributed alternative necessarily would have worked, but it certainly would have provided more resiliency. Eventually, it is likely that one of these severe climate change-induced storms is going to track into our Lenawee backyard. We've seen a couple of those already. Fortunately, not with the intensity that just occurred. There is a huge amount of information circulating in the press and social media. To counter this information, provide fact and data in lieu of opinion. Lenawee Solar was created by a small group of knowledgeable citizens with no stake in the financial returns of solar investments other than those that all citizens will enjoy from the transition to clean renewable energy. Lenawee Solar has recently created a website to enable citizens to become informed participants, and we welcome input and contribution to this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Any other comments? Yes.
He's an old guy with gray hair. You just said something that is important to people. A lot of people who are my age, a lot of people who are my son's age as well. I look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out a few weeks ago that if you haven't seen, you should take a look at. It is serious science and there are serious consequences for not addressing what Frank's talking about. So when I think about the future, one of the first things that I think about is how are we addressing climate change here in our own backyard. And here we have the opportunity to do that, to give a future, a better future to the kids that are coming up in this community. So I say we take that chance to go do that.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm Ben Miller. I'm Josh's son. Lived in Blissfield
You want to stand up?
Oh, yeah.
Your voice will project better.
Okay, so I do go to Blissfield schools, we live like 3 houses down from the school. And I wanted to kind of go back to Deb's point about how we need to create this place as a hybrid community. I think that solar is one of the things that can do that. And somebody mentioned here that farming has been decreasing from 30% to 2%, under 2% of farmers left. Part of that's due to like being able to have bigger tractors and more, being able to farm more land with one person. But part of that is because the industry is somewhat changing. Solar is something that is on the rise. I feel like with climate change coming in, there's going to be a lot of incentives and like subsidies, tax breaks to put solar on your land to help out with climate change. The government is looking for people to help with climate change, and solar is one of those things. The industry is changing, and we can be a part of that. If you look at what happened in like Toledo and Detroit, automakers, they moved away. It was cheaper. And if you look at that, some of the parts of those communities are not nearly as beautiful as they used to be. That kind of thing could happen here if we don't try and look to the future and look at things like solar. Sure, ordinances can change, I-6 or P-8-6 report. Right, that report might change in 2 years, might change in 4 years, might be completely different in 10 years. But what is not changing is that solar is coming, and there are major incentives, like Frank Baker said. It's cheaper to buy solar for your house now, because the government wants you to do that, because it helps with climate change. So I just wanted to make that point as the youngest person here. So, yeah,
Thank you. Yes,
I want to applaud Ben. I think things absolutely fantastic that an 18-year-old or 17-year-old, whatever he is, will come to a boring township planning commission meeting.
Thanks a lot.
Sorry, Jim, but you know how it is. But I just think, his input is so viable and so important that, we get a perspective from someone his age versus those of us that have been around, like Frank and I have been around here for 70+ years. And I just encourage you, I think it's really important that we do have ordinances in place. I think it's important to know that our ordinances are as least restrictive to the farmers as possible, so that we can reap the monetary benefits in this community, so our community will maintain a viable, beautiful community for my great-grandkids.
Okay, I'm going to close the public comment portion of the meeting so that we can move on and get to some of our business issues tonight. We wanted to deal with noise levels.
Before we go any further,
Yes.
so I provided you guys my resume
Yes.
electronically,
Yes.
and I explained to you why I provided you my resume.
Yes.
Because I was being challenged to make sure that I
And
didn't
I'm
have.
not gonna hire you, so.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, Don, I think that, thank you for providing that. I think that all of us have a perspective. We don't come to the Zoning and Planning Commission as islands. We all have our biases, we all have our beliefs. We're here to be able to come up with a zoning ordinance, and I think your point is well taken. I would like to point out though, what is the most efficient source of energy?
Sun.
No.
Yeah.
Nuclear. 98% efficient. 98% efficient. Well, again, I did some research here, okay? But if you look at that, the problem with nuclear is that it's got a lot of downside. What do you do with the spent nuclear, fuel? what happens if you have a catastrophic event? We all were around when Davis Bessie went down with a near miss, God forbid.
You mean to say the most efficient source of electricity or energy? There's a difference.
The sun is a nuclear reactor.
It is, yeah. So it's the source
Of electricity or?
of electricity.
Of energy?
I think electricity, wouldn't you say?
Well, I'm not sure how you came up with that number, so I really can't comment on it. I really don't understand.
Yeah,
the point of it.
but the reality is Don's a nuclear engineer, okay? So, and the question was whether or not there was some bias there.
Well, conflict of interest, there was concern that solar would replace nuclear, and I hadn't looked at it that way, to be honest with you. I know that maybe there might be one day I might do it. I don't think it's not before I retire from Detroit Edison.
No, I don't believe so either. Yes.
I was just going to add what you're referring to in efficiency. It's not really efficiency, it's the capacity factor. That's what nuclear power has, the highest capacity factor, meaning there's a certain amount of hours in the year. They can operate at 90%, 98% of the year versus other forms of energy which cannot operate as long. So it's not necessarily efficiency, but it's just your capacity factor.
That's correct. I agree with that statement.
Yeah.
I understand that statement. We do have a very high capacity factor.
Well, I just knew that nuclear was, my dad actually has a nuke in the Navy as well, and he does the same thing. So yeah, that's correct, for sure.
Okay, so regardless, I mean, we have lots of different forms of energy and lots of different sources, and that's what we're dealing with.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate that time.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Noise levels. We're going to be dealing with noise levels tonight. I know that we have already seen the RAND report. We've all seen the different decibel levels. Is there any hard evidence one way or the other as to what the number should be?
Well, I think that the RAND letter really just tries to explain the ANSI standard. So that's something that I want to make sure it's clear. So what he's trying to do is explain the ANSI standard to people like ourselves. To be honest with you, I've read it several times, and I did have a hard time trying to glean out exactly what his points were. So I want to make that clear that it's the ANSI standard is what is the value that he's saying is applicable, not the RAND letter. It's the ANSI standard. And there's only one other standard, and I don't have that number with me in front of me, but the World Health Organization provides another standard for providing or building industrial complexes in this type of aspect. So I just want to make that point.
Can you please identify what the ANSI standard is? What is ANSI?
Well, ANSI is an American national standard that engineers put together based upon certain criteria. I'm explaining that pretty carefully, so it's not one person, it's a group of people that put standards together that provide recommendations on what you should do for certain criteria. So, which I can give you an example. We use standards all the time in the nuclear industry, whether it be an ASME code. So, for example, boiling water reactors and boilers have all kinds of standards in which they design and construct things. So it's my understanding this ANSI standard is similar to like an ASME code for like a boiling reactor. So I want to make that clear. The RAND letter is trying to explain the ANSI standard. It's not trying to say you should use my letter as the standard.
Yeah.
So I want to make that clear. And the only other standard I know of, and I can work to provide that information, is from the World Health Organization, and it's a health issue. unwanted noise is been proven, has been proven to be a health issue to people.
Out in the back porch.
Or if, if an individual who lives on the land, is leasing the land, if they find, they can apply for a variance or whatever and say, hey, I'm okay with 40 decibels day in and day out. If the individual.
At the residence,
Yeah, they're residents on, close to their land.
not the back property line,
Right.
40 acres out.
Right, yeah. But I think that we're missing the entire point. That we're debating stuff we're spending a lot of time on something that's totally unnecessary and our thought process is wrong.
Yes.
I think, Javier representing ESA, I completely agree with him. I think from ESA perspective, what we don't want is to come up with a level that is unrealistic because you cannot even measure it on the road or in somebody else's house. So the problem that we have is not with the standard, is how you interpret the standard and how you don't read the small print that gives you the reference to how interpret what they are saying. When people are saying, oh, the inverters in a nuclear power plant are very noisy, well, I will ask, where are they? Are they in a electrical housing? Are they outside? Because that changes. Very interestingly, we hear the noise of an inverter on a cell phone that can increase the volume or decrease the volume. And we don't see the video. We hear the video, but we don't see the video. If Mr. Martis in here can show the video, you will see where the noise is recorded and is next to the inverter. But you guys, I think, know better because you visit a solar power plant in the middle of the day. You were next to the sub, next to the inverters, outside the plant, and could you tell me if you hear the inverters? Because that's the deal. If you don't hear the inverters, if you don't have any noise, are you sure you want to restrict even more than that?
Well, then 40 decibels should not be difficult to comply with if they're as quiet as Javier says. It's very simple.
That's right.
Well, we measure in front of Mr. Marty's house, and that measure reading was much more than 40 decibels. And it was in a quiet road.
If you were to step 300 feet away and play your video, it'd be interesting, your audio, excuse me, it'd be interesting to hear what the decibel level is here.
Well, I agree. It would typically reduce about 3 decibels per doubling a distance. That's common.
Yeah.
For 6 dB, low frequency, 3 dB.
We can provide the calculations. It's very simple.
I think we need to incorporate some kind of wording where we're dealing with decibel measured at our specific lot lines.
The solar, so the way we have it right now, the version I have,
Yeah. 40.
we said ambient sound pressure levels shall be measured from the property line of a solar farm and not exceed, in this case, the one I have says 40 dBA. I'm not saying the version I have is the latest, but this is the one I looked up. So we've already addressed this issue.
Yes.
The question is, what's the right level? Okay, and I think we're all in agreement. It can be designed that makes no sound at all. The point is, if you don't write the right value, then you can't hold anybody accountable when it's not working right, it's not designed correctly, it's not constructed correctly. So the reason you put this limit in there is so that you can hold somebody accountable to ensure that it's done the right way. And I think we're all saying the same thing.
I think so too. So I'm just going to take this one question, then we're coming back and we're going to really hash through the rest of this. Yes.
Mr. Behrman, I think you said, is that right? Sorry. I'm a Peace Corps volunteer as well. Peace Corps volunteer, but you said something about measuring from a residential line. You said measuring from the solar line. This is my point of clarity is important. Are you on the same playing field?
That's where we need to go. Okay? So the question is, where are we going to measure it? Is it going to be in the standing by the inverter? Is it gonna be at the project fence line? Is it going to be at a house? Does it make a difference if it's at the fence line? I would argue no, it doesn't make a difference. Following what Ivan said, in terms of there's nobody there, it doesn't make any difference. Where it makes a difference is at the house.
Well,
I don't agree.
I would,
I don't agree with that.
I would like to go from where the setback starts. Like if we're going, what, 150 back, be from,
Yeah.
that 150, where that setback starts from.
From the solar, the property,
So it's gonna be
which is
the-
what it says here, which it says,
Yeah, property line.
which is the property line of the solar farm, which is what we've said, and that's what's in our ordinance.
Yeah, so, but I mean, it'd be the setback area, I think.
I agree.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
Okay,
I think,
So
if
we-
you're understanding correctly, that's what our ordinance says right now.
Yeah,
In
that's
the,
what we got.
what the issue to me is, we've always said that, I don't think we've ever said anything different. The question here, though, is what is the right value? That's what we've been debating here. And again, then we got talking about the location, and that's what the ordinance says. And again, like I said, maybe my draft is slightly different, but I don't believe it is.
and
What
it's
we said.
currently is set at 40 decibels.
Yeah.
And that was the recommendation of the lawyer that drafted this? Or was that something, obviously,
Well,
I
I think
came
we
in.
decided
Recommendation.
that, I don't know why we did that.
Okay,
I think he just reviewed it.
okay,
That's what we came up with.
I believe that's what.
on the front end, okay,
Yeah.
because I wasn't part of that, okay. All right,
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Is that over and above the crickets and the wind and stuff?
Yeah,
or is
that'd be the
Just the
noise from
inverter.
that,
So that would have to
whatever
be-
they,
Or the-
whatever they're running there, yeah.
So if somebody had a complaint, it would have to be separated out.
And you'd have, yeah, of course.
so it'd be the inverter
They can't
or
stop the wind and say.
Well, I understand that.
We had a lightning storm last night and I heard the thunder while above their place.
So I listened to that one, the guy complained here at the last meeting, and I went up there, and the crickets were making more noise than anything in there.
So it's gonna be anything from the development, 40 decibels,
That's right.
okay, all right? Is everybody in agreement?
The 40 dBs is this is where we're gonna go back to the ANSI standard or the standard. So again, there's two settings to these standards. There's a daytime setting and there's a nighttime setting. And I recognize that even in this letter, it says, and they've always said this, it makes no noise at night, so then therefore 35 dBs at night is not an unreasonable thing to say. And I would ask that you follow the standard that's recommended by the,
What's the definition of nighttime?
Between 10 and 6.
We can define that, I'm good with that, I'm good with that.
So,
So I don't know what that is at the top of my head.
when
What
the
I can
sun's
do is go
not,
back and look at maybe some other ordinance and really define that. Excuse me?
When the panels are not collecting.
when the panels are not
Not
collecting?
collecting.
You know, that would be, sun's down.
So what time what would we,
It's gonna be variable because the
Right.
sun goes up and it rises and sets at different times.
But that's the dawn.
Dusk to dawn?
Since the dawn, yeah.
Noel?
I don't think there's gonna be many property owners who are gonna allow you to go into that 200-300 foot setback to take those measurements. So I guess you're gonna need to be prepared to, whatever legal action you need to have the rights to go on that property, to check those levels. Because it's, we're talking 300 foot setback from a non-participating resident. That 300 foot is owned by the landowner that has solar. They're not gonna give permission to go in and measure that.
Well, yeah, what we're saying is from the setback, and it was the start of it, so I mean.
Right, but you,
They'd
in
have
order
to,
to
they'd have to
they have
measure
to walk
from,
in there. They have to walk in that 300 feet.
no,
right?
they'd have to take it from
From
outside the
Would
property
you-
line.
Okay.
We would have to
We're not
walk on
talking
the
about-
opposite.
Yeah, you'd have to be a non-participating.
We could make an allowance for participants. You know, we have a 150-foot setback for for participants in the solar, if they, we could make an allowance to allow a higher decibel if they wish, since they're participating. The setback has already been reduced.
I would discourage making that kind of distinction, because the landowner then is going to sell their house. The person that is purchasing it is gonna come in and complain. And,
Just keep one standard.
yeah, it needs to be one standard.
And then you don't have to worry about it or fight it and say, okay, I was here.
Sorry.
Agree?
Yeah, I agree.
Will it be reasonable to hear if that type of noise is even possible to record? Because, again, we are talking that right now, you have more noise level than what you are requiring for solar. So without the solar, you still have more noise level. So maybe it's good to ask Ryan if that's even possible, if you can even possibly record on a road that has 60 decibels average, 40 decibels for a new technology on a solar farm, because it might be not possible. And again, if we are measuring the standard, we need to make sure that we understand what they're saying instead of.
Can you distinguish and measure the noises coming from different parts or different sources?
Sure, so you would select representative locations, the worst case location, the part of the property line that is closest to one of these inverters, for instance, if it was placed somewhere. I have done lots of measurements at some of these facilities and modeling studies for them. So typically how it goes is the inverter would be centrally located in a large field and then surrounded by panels, so that if you're talking about a property line of that, you're potentially hundreds of feet away from that inverter trying to measure this sound level. And it's a daytime-only source oftentimes, and that can be challenging because there are background sound levels during the day that far exceed that level. So if you're trying to measure that,
That's what I'm saying. How do you separate that out from cars going down the road somewhere or the wind?
So if the sun is shining and it's collecting and it's making sound, we would get some feedback from some data on whether it's on or off, and we take longer durations of measurements to see it was making energy during this time period, it wasn't here, it was on, it was off. And you can look at the difference in sound levels, you can subtract out a background sound level to an extent. If it's
Have you
too
done
close,
this? You've done this?
I have, but I'll caveat that by saying a 40 decibel limit would be amongst the most restrictive that I have ever seen over dozens and dozens of projects. And if you're considering a 35 limit at night, the substation may remain energized, is my understanding, at night. So if you impose a 35 decibel limit on the entire project, which includes the substation, and that applies at the property line of the substation at night, and during the day, you're effectively controlling the single loudest sound down to a level that is quieter than a library. So that would be challenging to demonstrate as compliant in our modeling, which is how a sound study is performed. We do conservative modeling to demonstrate, here's how this project would actually sound at its worst case. So I'm just giving an example of.
What do they usually run in worst case?
What's that?
What do you find in worst case scenarios when you do testing? What decibel levels?
The substation, what would the substation usually be?
Well, that depends on a lot of things, the size of the substation, where you're measuring from the substation. There are many different sound level limits throughout the country. Some of them will also impose a penalty for a tonal sound. So that is another option that could be, if you measure a sound and it's tonal, then apply a penalty, but I would not recommend starting that low and then applying a penalty, because that would be punitive, essentially, to the point where you could not construct it, and it would not be beneficial. At some point, it becomes diminishing returns, where you're mitigating down to something that cannot even be perceived to begin with.
Okay, what do you mean by tonal sound? Like what he was
like
playing?
a tone, like a backup beeper on a vehicle, something that is more noticeable because it is tonal. There's a lot of jurisdictions that will utilize that, but They do not start with the levels that you're talking about when they utilize that, just so you're aware. It's not start with 40 and then penalize. Those are usually in the 45, 50, and then that penalty applies. So depending on what route you want to go, and this is where the challenge is and how you impose this, you want to be sufficiently protective, but presumably also allow for some development to occur in the space. If the intent is to squash all development, then 0 decibels and
What do you mean by development?
A
Development of the whole project.
project, a facility. So I will say in general, solar as a whole is a remarkably quiet power source. I've done lots of studies on other forms of power generation, and the limits are generally higher than that for those sources that operate 24/7. So a solar facility that is at its maximum sound level only when the sun is shining is a more aggressive approach.
It seems we've learned something interesting here tonight. We've been in meetings now for nearly 2 years with these developers. This is the first time we've heard any discussion that I can think of about the need to construct new substations. Haven't seen any regulations proposed for the development of substations. We don't know how many solar projects could be built in the township, how many substations might be required. I don't recall seeing anything in solar ordinances discussing substations as a separate entity, size, setbacks, noise, etc. So
The reason is because substations are public utilities, and so they're actually owned by the utility company themselves, and jurisdictions don't have control over them.
So we will have a number of substations.
No, only one. A project might not even need a substation, but generally you're only going to have one at max.
Per project.
Per large-scale project. If it was a smaller scale, like the 20-acre project, I'm sorry, the 20-megawatt project that's north of here, it does not have a substation.
Lynette?
I'm kind of with Ivan. I think we're kind of missing a point. You said that you were going to gather information
Through. It has to go through several other stages of evaluation and approval before it would ever become, accepted, before the township board would act on it. Could there be a referendum to determine whether or not the statute is valid or whether it should be put into law? Sure, that could happen. It hasn't happened before, not in Blissfield Township. And it didn't happen when we put the master plan in, and it didn't happen when we put the new zoning ordinances in. But it certainly could. That is every voter's right.
So what about the farmers that want to sell and the farmers that do not want to sell? It's not going to be an eminent domain where they're just going to grab a whole section just to fulfill ESA's solar wishes.
I heard 2 different questions there. Okay?
So I know there's a lot of people that are for it, a lot of people that are against it. So you're gonna have pockets of those that aren't for it amongst the people that have the farmland surrounding that are for it. So would they just go around those people that don't want to have their solar farm in their property?
I think
how will that look?
I think that's a business decision that has to be made. One of the things that we all need to understand is that if there is a project that's going to be developed, and this is assuming that we have a positive ordinance that will allow it. But if there was a project that was going to be proposed and developed for Blissfield Township, that would come before the township board, before zoning and planning. There would be several other committees and reviews within the township and within the county before it would ever be approved. We have, these zoning ordinances are like the rules for monopoly. It gives the guidelines for what can be done within our township so that everybody understands what the rules are. can a zoning or a project developer come in and propose something to us and ask for a variance? Yes. Can they make other business decisions about how they're going to place the solar panels? Yes. Do we have control over where those are going to be placed or how those are going to be placed? Yes. So it's not a done deal, no matter what. Yes, Jeff?
Jeff Taylor, Blissfield Township. One correction, the farmer is not selling his land. It's only a lease for a period of time.
I don't know. They could sell.
They could sell, but that's not what's being asked for. It's a lease for a period of 35, up to 35 years, lease. And then it comes back to farmland again. That's the way the contract reads. I've read several from 3 or 4 different solar companies, actually. So it will return back to farmland, and that's stated in the Right to Farm Act, State of Michigan, and in the PA 116 round, that it gets returned back to farmland. And if you want a better explanation, maybe the solar company can make that definition for you, but the farmer is not selling the land, and I don't believe, unlike a utility, the solar company cannot take eminent domain on the property, like a railroad or a highway or a gas company or anything like that. Okay? We've had gas lines went through just by me, went across the road here, and some of the other people's land, and they just come in and pay X number of dollars for the use of that land. And the farmer has a little bit to say on how he's treated, but they have eminent domain and they can just take it and do it. So there's a big difference between some of this stuff. Now, if I would lease some of my land for a solar development, I farmed for, somewhere between 65 and 70 years already. And why I did it, because I enjoy farming. You know, I've been there, I worked in the shop for a while and so on, had a couple businesses, but I enjoy farming and I still farm today, okay? If I would be willing to give up a little bit of my land for the betterment of everybody and the development of solar energy, which is something, we need energy in this country, electricity. We need more and more of it all the time. Everything's going that way. If I would be willing to give up part of that for a few years of my lifetime and turn that over to my heirs, I think that's a good thing. And for people that aren't even going to be close to this to object to it, I have a big problem with that myself. Because it will bring a lot of money into the area as far as the taxes. The farmer's ground will be taxed the same as it always has been, by the value of the bare land. Any increases that are done on that land will be paid by the solar company. And that's about $35 million over that period of time. 35.1. Don't shake your head because it's true. Have you read a contract?
I'm a farmer's wife.
Okay. So why don't you believe it?
Because I don't.
Why?
Why would someone who doesn't own property pay the taxes?
Because for the infrastructure that they're being put on the land. They don't own the land, they rent it. So they pay on the, like Jim's got, his boy's got the business over here. He pays on that business tax for the industrial business tax. So you don't understand that?
Oh, I understand, but that's not.
Well, I'm sorry, but it's the truth. But anyway, that's all I got to say. I'm willing to lease out part of my land for a period of years to help development that's good for everybody, that'll bring in taxes dollars for the whole year, or for the whole period of time, to support the schools and roads and highways and stuff. If I'm willing to do that, somebody ought to be willing to let it happen and not complain about, oh, I don't want to see that in my backyard. Well, it's not going to be in their backyard. It's something that's 200 to 300 feet away is not in somebody's backyard. So I'll end there.
Go ahead.
I'm Cindy Winland, and I'm a planner, and I'm here with ESA Solar, and I just wanted to add a little commentary about the concept of eminent domain, if you're not familiar with it, that it is not employed here, that this is a private development. And eminent domain is used when a municipality or a state decides that there's an overriding public interest and that some form of development or land is required and that there's some compensation for that. This is a totally different thing. So just so that there's no confusion about using that term, just wanted to make that. This is a private development.
I had one clarification. I think you've raised a very important point, Diane. We're not writing an ordinance in the township for one development. We're writing an ordinance for any developer that comes. This developer may come with an intention of leasing the ground, but yet there are other developments in the county where the developers are actually buying the ground outright, at which point that was almost certain never to go back to agriculture. Secondly, the idea that the PA 116 rules today say that at X amount of time it needs to return back to agriculture. 2 years ago, the PA 116 rules said you couldn't build solar on PA 116 ground at all. I don't know what Gretchen Whitmer might do 2 years from now. My point is we can't depend on this developer's intentions and the current PA 116 rules as we develop a regulation for this township.
Your points are well taken, Mr. Martis. And I would also say that what we do with our zoning here in Blissfield Township, we control the zoning. And Mr. Martis is correct. There may be some solar companies out there that do purchase land, but that does not change the zoning. They would have to come back to the Zoning Board of Appeals and apply or ask for a change in that zoning. If Blissfield Township is agriculturally zoned and we want to maintain that agricultural basis, why would we change the zoning? Well, if the utility or whoever the project developer was wanted to change the zoning and we deny that change, what happens to the land? What are they going to do with that land? Because it's zone farming. They can't put a commercial building on it. They can't develop it as residential. What are they going to do with it? They're stuck because it has to be farmed, agricultural. I just want to point out one other thing. Eminent domain is very interesting. And as Ms. Whalen pointed out, it is used by townships, municipalities, and other public entities. DTE has been known, if somebody holds out, they'll come in and they'll take it via eminent domain. You can file a lawsuit and challenge the compensation that you're getting, but that's not going to change the fact that it's going to be taken from you. Case in point, remember Comerica Park? Was Comerica Park always there? No. I had a client that owned a parking lot and a store that sits under Comerica Park. And they took it via eminent domain and offered a pittance for that land. There was a lawsuit. The owners got the money that they should have gotten, but the land was gone, and they had to move their business. Yes.
There is a bright line here. Detroit Edison, for instance, or Consumers Energy owns and operates wind and solar projects. They do happen to be a public utility. Public utilities do have the right of eminent domain, but wind and solar projects are not being sold to the retail public. They're being sold to the wholesale market. Therefore, even though those companies happen to also own utilities, those solar and wind projects cannot use eminent domain to acquire land to develop a wind and solar project.
Yeah.
Only on the retail side.
2 years from now, it could change.
Yeah.
For all the more reason to have strong zoning.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. That is exactly what we're talking about here. So when people get angry at the zoning board of appeals and the zoning and planning because we refuse to allow variances, just step back and listen to what it is that you're saying and what we're doing. Because when we enacted the master plan and the new zoning ordinances, the attitude was no variances. No variances. All of those setbacks had to be required. All of those frontage requirements had to set the way they were. Strong zoning ordinances. That's what we're talking about here. And the application should be the same across the board for everybody. When we started this process, we couldn't even identify a single source of what those zoning ordinances look like. We had pieces all over the places, and variances all over the places, and exceptions all over the places. And we started from scratch. So the only way this is going to work, the only way we're going to maintain Blissfield Township as being the township that we know it today is a strong zoning ordinance. And that's what we're talking about. So for board members that sit in front of you, for board members that are appointed, for your participation as a community, every one of us have the obligation to sit here, to participate, and to do this. Every one of us. Jim, you were going to say something?
Yes, is this amendment considered to be a permitted use or a special approval use?
We haven't decided that yet.
I guess if it's a permitted use, and that's up to the zoning administrator if it fits. If it's a special approval use, then it comes back to the planning commission to say, you know, what do we think about this? So if you allow the first one in and you think you got too many, the next time you have a special approval use to approve, you can maybe work with that a little bit harder. But I think it is something that the planning commission needs to address.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. Because when you allow one person, I mean, and that's happened before in the township, we've got some issues hanging out there, you know, because of the history that I have with zoning and planning. I know where some of those problems are. We've got some issues that we're going to have to deal with at some point in time. They aren't ripe yet. It hasn't become an issue yet. But approvals were granted when they shouldn't have been. Go ahead.
Zeb Waterbury. We just bought a house over on Monroe Street before COVID hit, so it was an interesting time to move back to town. I grew up south of town, on the corner of Thompson and Yankee. I take your point, strong zoning. But I think strong zoning does not necessitate.
Okay.
So I just want to make that clear.
Okay, so.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we know that there are different sound levels. We all get that. And we know when we need hearing aids. Because we've either gotten too old or we've been exposed to too loud of noise. the question ends up being, where do we set the sound limit for a solar project in Blissfield Township? We know that a whisper is about 45 decibels. Normal speech, I'm talking a little bit louder, but normal speech is around 60 to 65. There's been some question regarding fluctuations in the threshold levels, or in the, what do they call those?
Frequencies?
The frequencies, there you go, okay? And how how the inverters work. And whether we should control that is an issue. What do you think? Where do we set the sound limit? Yes.
So when you're talking about these sound levels, are you talking about the whole solar farm as a whole, or each individual panel, or the inverter itself?
The inverter.
And how many inverters are we talking about?
I believe there's just one per,
I'd like to make a correction. I don't think that's necessarily true.
okay,
I think the sound limit would apply to anything.
okay.
It could apply to the arms.
Well,
Okay,
that's
so
true.
it would apply to anything. And so I want to make that real understood. And I don't know if I would quantify the number of inverters, because I don't know how many inverters it takes for 200 megawatts of power. So I'd be very careful your answer to this resident here.
Yep, point well taken.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, it's gonna depend on the project. It's gonna depend what the project plans look like when they come back to us.
My thought is, why not start at the lowest possible, so that if the frequencies increase, then you're still going to be within a normal range for people living in that area. Like myself, who live on Carroll Road and don't want to have to worry about, gosh, now I can never open my windows again.
The problem with starting at the lowest possible level is that then you can't have any noise at all.
That'd be great.
Unfortunately, the wind rustling through the trees comes along.
No, I don't agree with that statement either.
Okay?
When you set a noise limit, you're setting it for the project, the development.
Mhm.
And you're not applying it to wind noise. There's technology that can separate what noise is coming from wind and what is coming from whatever you're trying to analyze. So to try to compare that this should be compared to wind is, to me, not part of the right facts that you should be approaching this issue from. And that's the misnomenclature or the misunderstanding that continues to puzzle me in this conversation.
Okay, what would you propose then, Don?
I suggest using the ANSI standard, or the World Health Organization standard, which is, I believe, 45, 40, and 35. And I can get that number for you and provide that to you. I'm not prepared to provide it to you today, like I wasn't prepared to read this letter. But what I did try to look through it, it's great information, but I'm not seeing, I see an ISO standard, but I don't understand, is it providing a level? So the point is, of this letter, it doesn't tell you what's the right standard. All it does is, in the back, it references other ordinances. Well, to me, these other ordinances are incorrect because they're not using a standard. When we build a nuclear power plant, we do it to standards. If we're going to build this, allow ESA or whoever it is come in and build this, then I want these people to understand what the standard is we decided to build this to, and not compare it to wind noise, people speaking. That's the incorrect way to look at this. And I've worked in an industrial complex my whole life around noises, and
That's
this
the
is
only
very
way I
dear.
can understand it.
This is
If
very
somebody
dear.
tells me your voice makes this kind of noise, I mean, I don't have any way of comparing it.
I understand that point, that you're trying to give it an analogy that people can understand.
Because I don't understand this whole thing here.
I got that. It's very complex. It's a very complex subject matter. But the point is, the whole point is you need to follow a standard, a design standard, and not create something that people just thought was a reasonable number, as was pointed out by one of our residents here.
Okay. I hear what you're saying, yes. Would you like to speak?
Yes, hello folks. My name is Ryan Callahan and I prepared the letter that I see you have up there in response to the RAND report.
Great.
The purpose of the letter was just to provide context for some of the things because it is a complicated issue, and although it was a peer review just done by myself, it was a peer review of something that was just done by another single person. I'm happy to answer any questions that are sound related if you find that helpful. I'm not here to recommend a number. It is certainly not my place. I do not live here and do not make that claim that I know what the right number is for a right area. The challenge in setting a noise limit, and you guys have a very difficult task to become experts in all of these different things. I have the benefit of just being an expert on sound. I don't know about setbacks, I don't know about wetlands, I don't know about all those things. But I'm here to provide context if that's helpful. I did bring some show and tell. I have a sound meter if you're interested to see what a real decibel level is, just because they are a mysterious thing. This decibel scale can be sort of intimidating to see a number and what does that mean? What does my voice mean? And when everyone in this room stops talking, what is that sound level? So if that would be helpful to see, I'm happy to.
Be very helpful if everyone stopped talking.
Yes. Play around. Shout into it. If they don't have to audition for singing, you can do that.
Yeah.
In residential neighborhoods?
Yes, Frank.
And I think there's a bigger issue here in that the current noise requirements within the township for different special uses are either non-existent, none are required for some pretty substantial potential noise sources, or at much higher levels than what is being discussed here. For instance, special uses permitted are salvage yards, landfills, government buildings, utility installations, which, by the way, I think this is a utility installation.
No, it's not.
I would disagree with that
Let me
because.
finish first,
Understand.
and you can take issue with any part of it, that's your job. You can debate that, places of worship, motorized RV tracks, campgrounds, educational institutions. None of those carry any decibel limitation in the current ordinance. And we know that those certainly can be noisy operations. The only two that carry a restriction right now are extractive industries, which I assume we're talking about mining of some sort, where there's a 75 dBA at the residential property line, or wind operations at 55, both way higher than what is being bannered about here at this point. So I think you've really got to look at all of these simultaneously to come up with something that is reasonable and appropriate.
Can I offer a comment?
Yes.
Frank's argument has some weight, but what we know is science is advanced. So the standard Don was referring to from the World Health Organization now has a 2018 updated recommendation for wind turbine noise. 45 day, 40 evening, 35 night. That means that 55 should be updated. Second point, this is much ado about nothing because unlike wind turbines, for instance, the only way to mitigate that noise is distance. You can't put mufflers on wind turbines, right? They're too big. So all you can do is back them up. A low noise limit for a solar inverter is not an unreasonable burden because they can be enclosed in a number of structures to lower the noise or almost eliminate it at adjoining property lines. The only reason they would wish to have a high noise limit is because they wish to avoid the cost of building reasonable structures to reduce that noise. We're not saying you can't have an inverter. We're saying technology exists to limit the impacts of that inverter noise, which is why the Deerfield ordinance requires a masonry enclosure to mitigate the noise. It's very simple. Then the noise limit is not a limiting factor. If anything, it gives them more siting liberty for where they would place inverters.
But I think we have to be a little careful when we're talking about farming community. You know, you guys hear tractors going at night and combines. That is not quiet.
Neither is it every day, 365 days a year.
No, that's true too. But it does, you know, several months and weeks, you can hear it day and night.
Yes.
I would just note that the largest noise maker of a solar facility is your substation. Hands down, it's not really close, right? The inverter is actually probably second in noise after the actual substation. Substations are all over the country. There's the switch yard in the substation. Both would need to be installed for a solar system here, and you can see substations all around the community here. So it's very common to live right next to one. I've never heard of a noise complaint from a working or properly working substation. They're simply normal infrastructure, and that's part of what is talked about in that response to the RAND study. Is that the RAND study is deducting, I think, 15 decibels when it's basically saying it's an annoyance sound, right? Something that's uncommon. Well, the fact is that the largest sounds of the substation and the inverter, which are extremely common in all settings all around America. So that's basically the point I wanted to make, is that these sounds that solar farms create, which are minimal, are also extremely normal. And so that's all I wanted to point out.
Okay, just for reference, the sound meter up here was running between 59 and 63 during that last talking stint, okay?
I have an example of inverter noise here if you want to hear it, if it will play in here.
How close is
This is the checkers game where
It'll come
grandson
right after
and
this ad.
granddad will bond.
Yeah, but we don't know distance.
See, that's no louder than conversation. That's the same noise levels we're listening to here.
And what this is, okay, so can I just respond to that? All right, so that video is shared amongst anti-renewable groups all over the country.
This is done by Cypress Creek Renewables.
Oh, I'm aware,
It's their
yeah.
video.
I'm aware, yeah, that video is shared amongst everyone around the country, but there's inverters all around the country, and no inverter makes that type of noise. That's either a malfunctioning inverter or a doctor video.
Which the Cypress Creek man never said.
That's why I'm surprised that
I don't
someone
know,
did mention it.
I work around inverters at the nuclear power station, and that's what they sound like to me. I listen to them all the time, so to say that,
But you went to the solar project that was, number one, you're at a different inverter at the nuclear plant.
You work principally the same way, correct?
Well, no, there's a number of sizes of inverters, right? Followers at natural gas plant, that inverter is 5 times the size.
A low noise limit will make sure they use a very quiet inverter, so it only makes sense to adopt a low noise limit, and if they turn out to be noisy, they can enclose them in a masonry structure. Very simple.
Could you play that one more time? I want to see what it reads on here.
Well, sure.
60.
Well, that's a
Is that what it
video.
was?
from
That's
Cell.
60.2, I
Not
think.
gonna,
60.
that's right next to it.
Is from the inverters. And they'll rev up, you can kind of hear it got a little louder as the sun came out, and they'll rev up, but they don't get too loud.
They'll rev up, but they don't get too loud, the Cypress Creek guy says.
Where are they recording those noise levels?
So that's a.
I didn't give a noise level, I just gave a noise.
I think we're missing the whole, we're missing a point here. And the point is that we're talking about the decibel emissions from the source. But would it not be more valid to measure the decibel emissions at the point? So let's talk about where the decibels would be in a residential lot line. That might have to be more restrictive. But if the inverter or the substation is placed far enough away, we would have to, I think in crafting an ordinance, it might be okay to say 40 or 45 decibels in a residential lot line.
That's right.
That will have to depend on where the contractor ultimately decides to place
Because it might
his
be 60 or
mechanism.
65
Okay.
right
Now, if
next
there's a vacant, let's say from a road where there's no development around there, what's wrong with 60 decibels if there's no development, and if it's on a road, it's gonna be no more than ambient traffic, probably a lot less than ambient traffic. So we're all beating around the bush, and I think we're all mistaken in what we're doing here, in our perspective. The perspective is where you hear it and how you hear it. Okay? So let's think about lot lines. Let's think about distances from roads. This is where a would-be developer can place their mechanisms to conform to what we write and the decibels that we want. Put it on them.
That's right. And that's what it says in our draft
And
ordinance right now.
technology's only gonna get better on this stuff.
Right.
So, you know, the technology for all this is only gonna get better. We talked about 15-foot panels, no, 12-foot. The technology is only gonna get better to make these more efficient and to make them quieter. The public is gonna demand it. These people operate in a competitive environment. There's a very, very large amount of solar producers and people with the panels, the circuitry, the silicon goes all the way down the line. These people are, a lot of them are public companies, they operate in a competitive environment. And they want to make sure that they can provide the most quality and quietest equipment, the best equipment available. Or it's our business to do that, and the commission to make sure they do.
I agree with you.
I would generally agree
Right now,
with
we're-
that statement, but with a caveat. I mean, I have 50 acres within the village of Blissfield. So my concern would be with the noise level at the house or at the living area where I spend time. If you've got a 50-acre parcel, it doesn't make sense to require a reduced noise level.
From other townships and that type of thing. And Ryan has presented 4 or 5 different options here. And none of the options that Ryan presented were as low as 40. They range in average between 45 and 65. So I'm not really sure, I mean, like I said, you've looked at other townships' ordinances. What are you gathering from those townships? I mean, why are we trying to reinvent the wheel?
I would also offer, in the absence of any guidance, the default value that is commonly implemented is a 45, particularly for a daytime source. But
Macon Township is 45, as measured at any neighboring residence in existence at the time the solar farm was granted special land use approval.
And notice that is a special land use.
Yeah, right, that's this, yeah. But we also said between the hours of 9 a.m. and 7 a.m. And,
60 at the lot lines of the project.
yeah, 60 is lot line of the project. That's Macon.
Have you talked to Macon?
I have, and I believe they're going to be in the process of amending their ordinance.
Okay, I mean, thorny issues to be sure, okay? We know that what we've already come to, I believe, is that the measurement will be at the perimeter or setback of the project, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the question ends up being, are we gonna differentiate between daytime and nighttime?
I think you had a good point, that if they've taken in a lot of power on a really sunny day, it's probably gonna run for a while, I think. It stores power, right? It doesn't store power.
Now, the time that it is louder,
So it's gonna quit
the
right
time
then?
it's generating the most power, and then it's done. once
Okay,
it
so,
generates.
okay, I misunderstood what you said.
I would say the substation
The
substation.
has the ability to
Oh, okay. Well, that's-
re-energize.
It stays energized because it's connected to the grid, even though that we're not pushing power into the sub.
Okay, okay. So that's a new question.
Well, we should be clear, the substation noise will only affect one corner of a project. This project could be 2 or 3 miles long. The substation could be way at the other end. So we shouldn't conflate substation noise on one end of the project with a home 2 miles away.
That's right, I agree. That's the point, and as he pointed out, you might not need one. You don't know whether you're gonna have one, so the point is,
Yeah, why don't you write it
you need to write it to the solar ordinance for the solar panels.
for the project?
That's right. And not get confused in this conversation.
Okay, so
I
if we're writing it,
I propose we follow the ANSI standard, or we leave it at 40 dB and nothing higher. And I would say that the developer has to go back and look at their design, he has to look at their construction, and he has to look at how they're gonna maintain it, and they can get something within 40 dB. That's what I propose.
Do you have documentation on the ANSI standard?
Do I have the ANSI standard? No, I don't have a copy of it.
We do. We can send it to you.
Good.
Distance, are they saying the 40 decibel is that at the ANSI standard? Where would that measurement take place?
As we talked about, it would be at the
Property
No, I'm
line.
asking about the
If it-
ANSI standard.
I'd have
They
to- I'd
take
have to
the
look-
measurement and say at 100 feet, it's 40 decibel?
Right, we're talking standards.
Yeah, talking standards, what's the distance that they're
I
taking?
have to
from?
look at the standard itself. I don't know right offhand. I have not
Okay.
looked at it. I've only read the letter that tried to understand it, so I'm okay with that.
I mean, if it's,
So we do by the ANSI standard, and it's actually not a standard, but it's a statement about annoyance. And I'm sure Ryan can add more context to this, but there's 2 standards, and one talks about what compatible land uses are, and the other one talks about community response, which is an annoyance factor. And in both cases, they identify 65 dB as depending on the type of sound. And as Ryan mentioned, there's tonal, there's octave, there's all kinds of other kinds of sound. So it's quite high, actually.
I would also point out, if we're talking about that particular standard, those numbers are annual averages. That's an entire year. So it would be very difficult to impose an annual sound level number onto a project, because if you were to do a post-construction sound level measurement, take a meter like that and try to prove, do you comply or not, you can't stand there for 365 days and then average it into that level. And the fact that solar is off during the nighttime would obviously weigh heavily on that. So if you're basing it on that, I would just caution you that that number is not a momentary thing, that it's not a number that's happening right now, like me talking. It's an annual number.
So 40 LMAX would be a lot easier to enforce, wouldn't it? Right?
It's also based on subjective, it's a survey of people. So one of the questions is, what qualifies as peace and quiet to you? So the ANSI standard, I think that is not
Not
very
helpful.
useful.
Well, I'd like, maybe if you have a copy of it, instead of, maybe you could have provided the ANSI standard along with this letter, then I guess would be my point. I don't have a copy of it. I wasn't able
Then why are you raising
Access
a
it to you.
suggestion?
Excuse me?
You said you're all about standards, you're making a suggestion of 40 decibels without your document that you're saying your suggestion is from.
I'm okay with that, so help us provide the standard and let us read it, and I would table this conversation so we can look at it further. I'm okay with that challenge or that statement.
Okay, so next meeting, we're gonna come back and we're gonna deal with the sound level, and we're gonna review the ANSI standard.
Yeah.
We're gonna review the epsilon. We're gonna review the
I'm kind of ignorant. How do you spell ANSI?
ANSI.
ANSI?
Yep. We're gonna
See, I had
review,
I had a Y on the inside. I told you.
yeah,
Are you going to research tonal?
yep. We need to research the tonal sounds and the penalties associated that.
What did you also describe the
WHO?
No, the
LMAX. The
LMAX.
yeah.
So we need to understand LMAX versus
An annual or LEQ average for an hour, for instance.
Yes.
And I would just say, if
What's
there...
LMAX?
LMAX is an instantaneous, like 56 and a 55 speed limit, automatic penalty, instead of averaging your speed over an hour, like LEQ might do. Secondly, if we're gonna have paid consultants here on the behalf of the solar industry, I would petition the board and say, I would like to pay for Rob Rand to attend the next meeting at my own expense. If we wanna hear both sides of this issue, I'm willing to fly him in, or bring him in by Zoom.
Well, we don't have Zoom capability here, so, you know, I would say that if he wants to come in and provide any guidance, you know, to the board, that would be fine.
I can certainly give you all his cell phone numbers, and you can talk to him at my dime.
That's base for what? We have
Yeah.
demonstrated that they are
Yeah.
wrong, and somebody else can come in and say, no, it's actually
Yeah.
true. But the problem is that they don't have arguments, and then they complain.
Yeah.
Well, bring the arguments next meeting.
Yeah, but again, at some point, we're gonna have to really say this is it. So we're gonna review the ANSI, we're gonna have the ANSI standards, review the Epsilon report. We're gonna review tonal sounds and the penalties that are being imposed for tonal sounds. LMAX, the instant sounds as opposed to an average. We've already said that we're defining nighttime, or defining the time of operation from dusk to dawn. And we're saying that it's gonna be the decibels that's at the setback of the lot line. So we're looking at the edge of the project.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
Because I haven't understood exactly what, do you mean, so there's a property line, and then there's whatever setback, why would you measure it on the property, on the, let's say the landowner's land? Why would you not measure it at the property line?
No, it's the fence line of the project. So what happens is you have a project, it has a fence around it, and then you have a setback from the inside of the fence to where the panels actually start. That's the setback.
Is that at the property line though?
It's not the property line, it's really the fence line. It's the fence line for the project.
Inside the property of the landowner.
No,
So here's the property line. Fence line is here,
yes,
solar panels start over here.
exactly.
You're choosing to measure on the property owner.
The fence line,
Fence line, or the fence line that is on the property owner.
no, it's a fence line.
Inside of the property line.
Here's the fence line,
Yep,
solar panels over there.
Yeah.
Measuring here or here?
fence line.
Why were you measuring the fence?
Why not measure at the property line
property
where,
line.
where the noise would impact the,
Possibly.
the neighbor?
Seems like you should measure from the setback.
Start of the setbacks.
Now, with the setback, that the person shouldn't be up there against the fence anyway.
I was, we wrote property line.
That's right.
Did we? Okay,
Yeah, I think.
All right, so it's property line.
That was always my understanding when we were talking, I thought you were talking.
That's why we wrote down property line.
Yeah, property line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
not the fence line.
Not fence line,
Okay, all
property
right,
line.
my error.
Yeah, okay, well, I have property line now.
Okay. Okay. Okay, and then we're going to identify what the decibel's gonna be, whether we're going to have a tonal sound penalty, and what that, once we get all the data put together. Okay, let's just quickly run through landscaping. I think landscaping, and correct me if I'm wrong, okay? Landscaping is something that is gonna have to be dealt with. The MDA, Michigan Department of Agriculture, is gonna come in and they're gonna tell the project for PA 116 ground what they're going to be able to plant there, okay? In terms of landscaping, I think that should be something that needs to be considered with each project. Do we need to mandate landscaping?
We have that in our draft ordinance. You saying take it out?
No, I'm just asking.
We've already created that. What I would
Okay.
suggest is that maybe the action we need to take from now until the next meeting is review what we've already drafted
Okay.
and decide if there's any changes to what we've already drafted.
Okay, point well taken.
Maybe justifications as well.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah.
One
Well,
question.
like the setbacks being kind of numbers that were thrown around, or I wasn't here at the last meeting. I guess what I've heard is these are numbers that were plucked from somewhere. I don't know where. But if we're talking standards, let's talk standards. What's the justification for the setbacks that y'all put in your draft? Standards are standards. Let's use standards.
Of course, then we'd have to ask a question like, what were the standards used to set a 35-foot height limit for homes? Well, it's because we didn't want to see 40-foot high.
Yeah.
That's why. And so a 300-foot setback could be an aesthetic consideration.
Yeah, that's
I think
just
that
our.
is justification.
A couple things. The 35-foot height is based on your insurance rates and your ability to fight fires, and that's how the height of a structure is set.
Not
for hazard
necessarily.
purposes.
Not necessarily. We see higher height limits for homes all the time.
Well, it depends on where you live, but that's an aside. I also just wanted to make a comment about the special use permit versus a use by right. The nature of the regulations that you're writing are going to require that this is a special use permit.
Yes.
So I think that you can, consider that aspect of this solved.
And I've heard the discussion that we can add additional burdens at the special land use process. Yes, that's certainly true, but I will say in my experience in the last 12 years in the renewable energy zoning space, adding additional burdens at the permit stage is the surest path to litigation, because the developers are going to want to argue they're arbitrary and capricious again and again and again. My strongest recommendation is if you get the regulations into the body of the ordinance itself, that's the safest path forward for the township.
I would actually concur with that because we don't want to not know what, yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks, man, I
I think
appreciate
on
that.
on the tree planting or whatever, around the project ought to be somewhat set by the person's yard that it's going around or whatever. Some people, if the panels are only gonna be 12 feet, maybe they don't want a 25-foot tree around their property. And they should make that decision, not you as a board. That property owner that's not participating should make that, or participating, should make that decision themselves. That should be open and not a requirement.
And you can mix performance standards
You have to have.
I like that idea, why don't you say that?
Do you have to have?
Okay,
Around
hang on just a
property
minute.
for trees?
Hang on just a minute.
So, Mr. Euler, your point is that maybe the homeowners next to a project might not want a tree that tall, that's fine. But if we come up with a standard, whatever that standard is, and the homeowner who's adjacent to that project decides that they don't want something that high, the homeowner could request a waiver for a lower,
Does he have to pay to come into a board of appeals board or
No.
whatever?
No, because that's gonna be, when the whole thing is before the board. When these plans get presented, now, again, this is assuming that we have a solar ordinance that is going to be open for this. If there is a plan that's presented, there is an application fee. There are fees that the project company has to pay for all kinds of different experts to come in and evaluate it. So those additional fees are already paid. The company, project company anticipates that they're gonna pay for those fees on the front end, in addition to the significant fee that they pay the township for going through and reviewing this. Yes?
Just to add something on landscaping is whenever, prior to submitting an application, we would go around to each individual property owner if there was a solar array near them, and we'd ask for their input on how to address it. That could be what type of tree, it could be, the line that the tree is on, it could be about the shrubs that they want around it. It's generally a conversation that we have with each landowner, and that's the time we would usually get a waiver. They said they didn't want one, and then we would put that waiver into our application. It's not a form waiver, but it's simply they signed this saying that they didn't want the landscaping.
Yeah.
And the process for a special use permit requires that a site plan come in with that. So the whole project plan and the permit come in together.
And you have to show what they're gonna.
Right,
Yeah.
so unlike the zoning request, where it applies to anybody, a special use request applies to the project itself. And so that's why you can come in with, you know, essentially negotiated settlements with property owners ahead of time.
Okay,
Another question. I'm Lynn Keller, I have property in Blissfield Township. In your draft ordinance, is this landscaping on the lines, the property lines, or is it going to be on the property of the solar property? Where's this landscaping going to be? Back by the fence, or up by the property line? Where is it going to be?
So it says, that our draft ordinance, the one I have here,
Yeah.
says the perimeter of the solar farm shall also be screened and buffered by installing evergreen or native vegetation planting whenever existing natural vegetation does not otherwise reasonably obscure the solar farms from any public street or adjacent residential structures, subject to the following requirements. So, I don't, let's see.
it sounds like it's fence line.
Sounds like it's, yeah, it's on the solar project line, the way I'm reading this as it stands right now, and we could read that further just to clarify. There's a whole bunch, it's about a half a page of description of what we wrote so far, at least the one I have.
Yeah.
So we went to great extent to write this. Remember, we had, one meeting was all on this topic.
Okay.
So that I understand this correctly, the way it's written, they want the landscaping up against the fence. No?
No, it'd be in the setback.
In the setback.
So
The
between
whole
the fence
300
and the
feet?
panels. No,
Not understanding.